Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and this is Headlines in History from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, where we digest the most important updates from the world of diplomacy and foreign policy and take a short dive into one of the most pressing issues of the day. Today we're delving into the ascent of NATO's newest Secretary General, former Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte. Since taking office as the head of the West's premier military alliance at the beginning of October, Rutte thus far has doubled down on his predecessor's support for Ukraine while balancing his messaging amid fraught election year politics in the United States. But before we get into that, let's take a look at some of the biggest foreign policy trends that have been going on in the past few weeks.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
So, Freddie, what do we have on the docket today?
So, good afternoon, Kelly. First, today we're going to be talking about the recent diplomatic deal to settle a long-running territorial dispute between the UK and one of its former colonies, Mauritius. Next, we'll get into the latest updates on the dire situation in Haiti and the UN-backed Kenyan-led police mission that's just been renewed. For the last item of our news roundup, we'll get into Tunisia's recent presidential election that saw the country's autocratic leader secure a second term in office. Finally, we'll turn to our conversation with Georgetown Security Studies Professor Sara Moller about NATO's newest Secretary General, Mark Rutte. So let's start our news section in the Indian Ocean, where the United Kingdom has just wrapped up a deal with the African island nation of Mauritius to end a territorial dispute that has lasted for around half a century. The deal hands back the Chagos Islands, a set of islands that houses a key US military outpost, Diego Garcia, back to Mauritius, as long as the American base is allowed to keep operating for the next 99 years. Kelly, you don't really see this kind of diplomacy very much these days where European nations are giving up the last bits of their overseas holdings. How did we get here and why is this happening now?
Yeah, we wanted to touch on this issue because it has so much going on. There's a little bit of old school but pertinent issues of colonial legacies tied with a lot of current geopolitics because of the US base at Diego Garcia. So, just as a reminder to our listeners who are probably familiar with it, but the US base in Diego Garcia has been in US control for since the 1960s when it was part of a diplomatic deal between the US and the UK to lease the land for a base for 50 years. In exchange, the UK got some discounts on military equipment, things like that. But Diego Garcia, which is also to remind folks, this is in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Diego Garcia is on one of the southern Chagos Islands, and it's been extremely important for the U.S., especially in the last couple decades with wars in the Middle East and counterterrorism operations in Africa. And it's going to be extremely important moving forward as the U.S. evolving relationship with India continues to evolve and as China continues to sort of push outward into broader areas geopolitically. So Diego Garcia, important to the U.S. The move by the British government, giving some of these islands back, is interesting given how long the dispute's been going on and how intent past governments have been on keeping the islands. Remember, there's a new Labour government in Britain at this time. Prime Minister Keir Starmer might be signaling a policy shift away from sort of the Brexit era nationalist politics, and this might be some sort of move to re-engage with the world in a way that's a bit more friendly to multilateralism. That remains to be seen, but it could be part of that. The Chagos were previously thought of or described as being Britain's, quote, last colony in Africa. So this news is sure to play well with those who argue in favor of decolonization and the global South writ large. The UN General Assembly, for instance, in 2019, by a large margin, voted to condemn the UK's possession of the islands and demand their return to Mauritius. And it's been similar rulings in different international courts over the past decade or so. And as we noted, the strategic implications are also interesting as the major condition set forth by the Brits was the continuation of the US base at Diego Garcia for the next 99 years. Mauritius, for its part, does have good relations with the US, cordial relations, but leans more towards China, which has been ramping up investment in industry and infrastructure in Mauritius in recent years. So the base in Diego Garcia was sort of an important point to keep in there and to keep U.S. access to that moving forward. And something else to note as well is the deal also allows the Mauritian government to resettle the islands as its sovereign territory, which has been a source of criticism by some indigenous Chagaosian communities that were displaced from the islands in the 60s and 70s. When I look at this, I can't help but see areas of similarity with what's going on in the Pacific Islands. And what I mean by that is this is also an important move in light of the way the United States and its East Asian allies have responded to Pacific Islands that have moved more into the Chinese orbit recently due to what they have perceived as years of the US and other Western allies, kind of quote, not showing up in the region. So this move in the Indian Ocean by the Brits and mostly the Brits, but the US is in favor of it, could go a long way to sort of head off these types of moves in as far as the Mauritius Islands are concerned.
Now, let's turn to the Caribbean, where a UN-backed contingent of Kenyan police officers is trying to help Haiti in its battle against powerful gangs that have overrun much of the country, as we've covered on this podcast before several times. The UN Security Council at the end of September renewed the mission's mandate for another year, which paves the way for the roughly 400-strong police force to continue operating and for future deployments to continue. While there was eventually expected to be around 2,500 armed personnel to bolster the country's security forces, the mission has been criticized since the beginning for being too little, too late. Kelly, what's changed since we last talked about this story in March, and has the deployment of the Kenyan mission changed anything?
So yeah, since we talked last March, the situation was horrific in Haiti. It's still pretty horrific, but the Kenyan-led mission is now on the ground and taking some actions. As you noted, it is only about 400 troops. It's supposed to be around 2,500. So, the criticisms of too little, too late are somewhat ringing true, but we'll see how things go moving forward. The renewal of the Kenyan-led mission in Haiti is obviously a welcome occurrence, if not necessarily all that surprising by the Security Council. The initial deployment was for just a year, and the Kenyans didn't actually get there until earlier in 2024. So they've actually only been fighting on the ground or helping out the Haitian forces for a few months. So they desperately need the extra time. This extends it for another year, starting, as of September. So it'll get through next September, and it calls for additional contributions of personnel, funds, and material. And, as I noted, thus far, they haven't really made a huge impact against the powerful gangs. They control much of the area around the capital city of Port-au-Prince. They've helped bolster the national police and allowed them to kind of go out and take on these gangs while they're doing more of the administrative stuff sort of behind the scenes. But with only 400 officers, they are still lacking substantial firepower and equipment, like, they're lacking armored vehicles and the types of things that you need to push these gangs out of the areas that they're heavily dug into and have been occupying for months at this point. The mission's leaders also, since day one, as you can imagine, in a situation like this, have been calling for more support, but that's been slow in coming. And part of that is issues at home in Kenya, but also increasing funding shortages. With the funding for this, around 600 million was pledged by UN member states, but only about 85 million has actually been contributed at this point, which is a huge issue as we're trying to man this force and get it set up with the right kit that it needs. The mission's also legally not a UN mission, which means that it relies on voluntary contributions, which is kind of hampering things at this point. That's where we are now. I think it's important, that we've got Kenyan troops on the ground. They're trying to take back areas that the gangs have been controlling for months. They're trying to rectify the situation as best they can. But this is going to be a long-term issue and something that they're not going to fix overnight. Like we said, they're going to need more money. They're going to need more forces. They're going to need more equipment. And, we're going to keep following this as we move along. But it's good that they're there. And it's good that the UN has extended this for another year. But more needs to be done.
And as the interim prime minister of Haiti said last month, we are nowhere near winning this. And the simple reality is that we won't without your help, speaking at the General Assembly in New York. So hopefully that help, and also importantly for UN-led missions, that time, that political capital lasts. Let's finally go to North Africa, where Tunisia's authoritarian president Kais Saied recently won a second term in office. The official numbers state that Saied captured just over 90% of the vote, but that obscures an abysmally low turnout rate of under 29% after the opposition called on its supporters to boycott the election. Saied's re-election marks a continuation of the trend that has seen the country slide from becoming a nascent democracy after the Arab Spring to a return toward authoritarian rule. The president, in his first term in office, has jailed most viable opposition candidates, cracked down on journalists and other civil society groups, dissolved parliament, and wrote a new constitution to bolster the powers of his office. Kelly, how did Tunisia, which was until recently held up as the only successful democracy to emerge from the Arab Spring, backslide so far and so fast?
Yeah, so this is a very unfortunate story. And, I remember as an intel analyst covering Middle East stuff, in 2011, everybody remembers Tunisia as the first. This is where the Arab Spring began. It was the first country to overthrow its dictator and install a democratic government in its place. It had, free and fair elections. And it really looked like sort of, the positive case study coming out of the Arab Spring. And unfortunately, 13 years on or so, that doesn't seem to be the case. So, this is a few years in the making. What really caused this was, as we noted, in the post-revolutionary period, Tunisia had free elections, it had a free press, it had an independent judiciary, strong civil society, and all these things that you think make a democratic government move forward. But the gains really didn't deliver the jobs and sort of equality and accountability that the Tunisians had been demanding and why they had risen up in an uprising to begin with. And, the old boogeyman of corruption seeded itself back into Tunisia and really undermined a lot of the democratic processes that were going on and didn't allow for these gains to trickle down to common Tunisians. So in 2019, when Kais Saied ran for president the first time, everybody saw him as, sort of this incorruptible guy who had taught constitutional law before being elected president, that he was going to tackle government corruption and dysfunction and really sort of revive the bad economy in Tunisia. What has happened in its place, though, as you noted, is that he has basically gutted the Tunisian opposition. He's cracked down on nearly all opposition candidates, journalists. He's shuttered a lot of civil society organizations and really undermined the democracy in a way that is building an autocracy in Tunisia. People initially cheered his victory and they cheered some of the moves he made as recently as July of 2021 because they thought he was going to do these things that he said he was going to do, but it's still, this corruption hasn't been tackled, the dysfunction hasn't been tackled, and these gains still haven't trickled down to normal folks in Tunisia. But at this point, Said has been able to undermine democracy so much that he has created a system of one-man rule and created a system where we just had elections that were basically illegitimate. Sad story coming out of Tunisia, and also demonstrates the fragility of democracy and points to larger issues of democratic backsliding that we've been seeing over the past decade or so. So that ends our news roundup. We now move to our conversation about the latest updates in the NATO transition with Dr. Sara Moller. Dr. Moller is an associate teaching professor and director of international and alumni affairs in the Security Studies program at Georgetown University. She is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Let's listen in to the conversation. Sara, thanks for joining us. Happy to have you here.
My pleasure. Looking forward to a good conversation.
So just going to hop into it here. We've had Jens Stoltenberg as the head of NATO for the past 10 years. Now we've got Mark Rutte coming in as the new Secretary General. Can you walk us back through sort of, Stoltenberg's term in office over the last decade and where is he leaving the new Secretary General as he settles into his new role?
Sure. Keep in mind, as you said, that he is the second longest serving Secretary General in Alliance history, having served for 10 years. So there's a lot of territory, so to speak, to be covered. His tenure has certainly been quite momentous, to say the least. But I think it's probably worth reminding the leaders what the world looked like a decade ago when he assumed office, because the world has changed notably since then. There's a lot that's been happening and transpired. So when Stoltenberg entered office in October of 2014, the alliance was still trying to come to grips with Russia's annexation of Crimea that March and Moscow's gray zone activities in the Donbass. It was very much an alliance still scrambling to find its footing in that regard. I think it's worth keeping in mind also that, again, this is 2014. NATO's primary focus at the time when Stoltenberg assumes office is still Afghanistan. ISAF, the International Security Assistance Force, would be terminated later that year in December, but the alliance is still focused on Afghanistan. So it took Stoltenberg and the alliance itself several years to fully understand the nature of the Russian threat and begin to develop a strategy in response to counter it. I think it's also worth noting that Stoltenberg had another strategic curveball thrown at him early in his tenure, which was the election of Donald Trump as the US president. And I think ultimately that will probably end up being his main legacy, his ability to weather that unpredictable relationship and keep the US president at the time from doing permanent harm to the alliance. I think when we look at his record as well, it is defined increasingly so by the full scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, another strategic curveball that was thrown his way. And it's also worth noting that his term was extended 4 times, a record 4 times. Now, not all of those extensions were due to the Trump factor, the fact that the allies didn't want to rock the boat, so to speak, while they had a secretary general that, to the extent anyone could, was good at managing the relationship with Trump. But those extensions also happened because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, full scale invasion in the spring of 2022, and the fact that the Allies, quite frankly, couldn't agree on a successor. There was some initial opposition from the Easterners to Mark Rutte. So there's a lot that has transpired during his 10 years. He certainly deserves a well earned rest. The last point I'll make about Stoltenberg before turning to Mark Rutte and the alliance that he is stepping in to lead at this moment in history is that in the last 6 months of his tenure, I would argue, Stoltenberg became a much more activist or assertive Secretary General. I think we saw that especially with respect to his stance on Allied aid to Ukraine, prodding, urging allies to do more, especially with respect to certain weapon systems. And I think in some respects, he got ahead of his skis in this regard, certainly ahead of where the Biden administration and some allies were comfortable of going. And it's clear he knew his time was winding down. This would be his last opportunity to shape not only his own legacy with regard to Ukraine, but also really the alliances. And so Mark Rutte is obviously stepping into Stoltenberg's shoes at a different moment in time. He is very much still in the honeymoon phase, having just been on the job for 2 weeks at the time of our recording. So he's been busy traveling to several capitals to pay house calls, if you like, on the respective allied governments. It is notable here that his first visit was to Kiev, and he met with Zelensky there, where he, of course, reaffirmed the pledge that the allies have previously made that Ukraine will one day join the alliance. So I suspect that for the next 6 months, not longer, he will be focused on Ukraine. And obviously, a lot will also hinge on the results of the US November election. But I'll leave it there.
You noted, Stoltenberg, 10-year reign, leading the alliance through, arguably one of its most consequential decades in its history. Now we've got the new guy at the table, Ruta. So what is he bringing to the table in terms of maybe sort of a broader vision for the alliance? And what kind of experience is he coming to the position with? Is it comparable to Stoltenberg in terms of his vision?
I'm not sure I would say the vision thing is where the comparison is because the context, the security landscape is so different, frankly. But I think there will be a lot of continuity owing to their similar backgrounds. They are both former prime ministers of small Western European countries, countries which are often led by coalition governments. In Rutte's case, he was Prime Minister of the Netherlands for 14 years, so he's an experienced leader, especially when it comes to navigating coalition politics. He's governed with support from both the far right and the center left. So he is a consensus builder. He's a conciliatory politician, a consummate politician who knows how to make a deal that everyone can live with, which is without a doubt, I would say, probably the most important skill any secretary general can have. And like Stoltenberg, he has a proven track record of being able to handle or manage Trump, again, to the extent that any mortal really can handle or manage him. He was, in fact, known as the original Trump whisperer, largely owing to his intervention at the 2018 NATO summit, where he reportedly persuaded Trump not to pull the US out of the alliance if the allies didn't increase their spending. So he's got a lot of experience. As to the vision thing, I think it remains to be seen, of course. But as I noted, I suspect that the early part of his tenure is going to be entirely consumed with Ukraine. And I would say one point of departure from Stoltenberg will be that he will probably early on be less forward leaning on building ties with US allies in the Indo Pacific, which is something that Stoltenberg championed, particularly in the last 2 years of his generalship. And another point of departure, I would argue, will probably be in terms of NATO EU relations. This is another area where I suspect we might see a shift or a departure from the Stoltenberg years. But again, this is partly due to circumstances, right? In light of all that's transpired in the last 2.5, 3 years, it's clear that NATO and the EU need to do more together in terms of security cooperation. Also, the personalities involved, Rutte and Kaya Kallas, the incoming commissioner for foreign affairs and security policy, I suspect are going to be working very closely together.
Diving down into a little bit more Ukraine specifics, one of the thorny issues that Ukraine has been pressing its NATO allies or NATO partners on has been unshackling the use of long range weapons to strike targets inside Russia. So, Rutte himself, in his first trip to Ukraine that you mentioned, called for such measures. Where do you think we are on that moving forward now that Rutte is at the helm? And also tied to that is this idea of giving more sophisticated arms outside of these long range weapons as well. Like, I think back to the long discussions over whether or not to give them tanks and then to give them F-16 fighter jets, which we eventually did. So, is there much more that the West can provide that may give Ukraine an edge in the current stalemate? And sort of where do the NATO countries see themselves right now with all of that?
Yeah, excellent questions. Let me take the first one first. I think it's worth reminding on the long range weapons debate the audience that these are ultimately national decisions, right? These are national, in this case, US weapons or French weapons or British weapons. So these are calls that will be made in London, Paris, and Washington, not in Brussels. So while the Secretary General is entitled to his opinions, right, it's going to be in this case up to the Biden administration and after January 25th, 2025, whoever occupies the White House to make that call. I know the Biden team has received a lot of criticism for not allowing the deep strikes onto Russian territory, but I'm very sympathetic to the constraints they have to navigate here. The considerations they have to factor in are numerous. First and foremost, obviously, there's the risk of escalation. And some might argue, indeed, some have argued, that Putin has perfected the art of nuclear saber rattling. But I like to say that the problem with the parable of the boy who cried wolf is that at the end of that story, the wolf came. And there's also the question separate from nuclear escalation, which the New York Times recently highlighted in a report that stated that the USIC, the intelligence community, has concluded that lifting that prohibition on the use of long range strike missiles could lead Russia to retaliate in other ways against US and NATO allies. So I guess ultimately this comes down to how risk acceptant you are. I'm pretty risk averse by nature. We have a lot of theories in IR about managing escalation risk, but we still don't understand that process very well. The Biden administration has also argued that these weapons may not have the military utilities that some of the proponents of lifting the prohibition on their use have argued. In fact, I think it's also worth reminding our readers, or excuse me, listeners, that these longer range missiles have actually been used by the Ukrainians in and around Crimea, and we haven't seen the anticipated battlefield effects yet that proponents of their use have argued. So, all of which is to say, anything could still happen. There's a chance that the Biden administration decides to lift its restriction after November 5th. So, we may have to wait and see. I also think there's something to be said for doing something and not announcing to the entire world that you are doing it. I think you get what I'm trying to say here. But I think the first point I'll make is that ultimately, in the final analysis, these are US or British or French weapons, not alliance weapons per se. So it's not an alliance decision, but a national sovereign call that each capital ultimately has to make. Turning to your second question about what else the allies can do, well, is there much more left in the West's military reserve to give Ukraine, given current developments? I would say not really. Several countries are approaching. Some have, in fact, already approached the limits of what they can give in terms of military equipment. Some privately are starting to express concerns that they may have been too quick to empty their own storehouses in light of the long lag times associated with defense production schedules. And of course, as always, there is the contributing factor here of domestic politics, and not just US domestic politics and the outcome of the US election. And here, the ultimate makeup of Congress will matter as much as who wins the White House, but European domestic politics as well. I think there's a sense of Ukraine fatigue in many parts of Europe, though capitals have tried to hide it. So there are constraints that suggest several allies are reaching the limits of what they can give that they haven't already given to Ukraine.
We can't have this podcast in October of 2024 without talking about the election, obviously, and you've mentioned it multiple times because of the stark dichotomy between the two candidates and their policies and what we think their policies will be in terms of NATO and the war in Ukraine. So, how do you think, or how has Rutte and NATO sort of been girding themselves for post November 5th?
By doing all they can really do, which is staying mum, right? Rutte is a consummate politician, and he's going to continue to stay silent in the 2 or so remaining weeks of the US campaign cycle, and he will extend, as will NATO writ large, a warm welcome to whoever becomes the president-elect after November 5th. There's a longstanding tradition or norm, if you prefer that term, that allies and especially secretary generals don't comment on the electoral process or internal politics of allies. Now, in recent years, this norm has been slightly eroded with respect to Hungary because of Viktor Orban's policies, but I don't expect Rutte to make any departures from this tradition in the US election cycle. There's been a lot of talk, as I'm sure you've heard, of Trump proofing the alliance. But frankly, I find that a little bit silly because it betrays a lack of understanding of how central the US is to the alliance's day to day operations. I also think it's worth noting that there are some unknowns about a Harris administration, right? Obviously, Harris administration is going to have a different policy toward NATO and Europe, as you alluded to, than a second Trump administration would. But she's still very much an unknown entity in several European capitals. Yes, she will be supportive of NATO and Europe, but she's of a different generation than Biden, who really was the last of the so called post World War II transatlanticists. And I think here her team also, including probably most importantly, whoever she selects as Secretary of Defense, is likely to be of a different generation as well. So there are a lot of unknowns in this regard. And I think it's also fair to say that a Harris administration would probably want to continue the infamous pivot begun under Obama, which every administration pretty much since then has tried to carry out, but always gotten derailed. And of course, they're going to have their hands full with events in the Middle East as well. All of which is to say, I'm not sure how much bandwidth there will be in the next administration, even a Harris administration, for a so called Europe First strategy. I think it's worth noting that NATO has already set a number of reforms in motion since 2022. And frankly, it's up to the Europeans at this stage, not Washington, to carry out those reforms and carry them across the finish line.
All right, Dr. Moller, I appreciate your time and thanks for giving us an update on the NATO transition and current events in Ukraine.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it.
Thanks again to Sara for her time and thoughts, and thank you for listening to this episode of Headlines in History. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Jarrett. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GUDiplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.